Hi, everyone. This is Kurt Roney. For those of you who haven't met me, I'm your instructor. In this video recording, I'm going to share with you some slides, frankly, several slides, that were prepared by another team that studied the strategic assessment case of PepsiCo Inc., one of the really American corporations that has been of recent years trying to extend itself into more international markets. But PepsiCo is simply a great American company that has gone through quite a history, quite an evolution. From originally a maker of carbonated soft drinks, ultimately to a much more diversified corporation, making snack foods under the Frito or Frito-Lay brand, and along the way has diversified into some other industries as well, without nearly the same success that it has had with Frito-Lay. So I'm going to step through a strategic assessment following the principles of strategic management that we've studied in this course, going through the process step by step, just as we've gone through them in the course. I'll warn you now, this is a long presentation. It has a lot of slides and a lot of material in it. It's going to take quite a while. And I think probably what I'll do is to break the presentation into 2 or 3 components so that you don't have to look at it all at once. You can look at it in components. With that warning, let me get started by sharing the screen here, and we can get started. Okay. So here we are with the PepsiCo, the corporation, and if I can advance this slide, we'll just get moving here. I hasten to add that this presentation was prepared by a team of students, just like you, who did this rather ambitious study of PepsiCo. So although I'm presenting the slides and talking about them, these slides were prepared by others, by a team of students, with my help, under my guidance. I've removed their names from the title page simply to protect their privacy. But if I could share their names with you, I would do that because I was very pleased in the good work that this team did. So to get started in the background section of this presentation that they did, we'll look at the history of PepsiCo, its mission, its lines of business, just as I have taught you. So the history of PepsiCo is very detailed. You can see that it has gone through quite a number of acquisitions to expand the breadth of its lines of business over the years. This is a summary of the acquisitions that PepsiCo has made, and you see right away just a lot of them. Back in 1964, just a couple of years before I joined PepsiCo, it acquired Mountain Dew, and that became a very popular drink. Also, the company in '65 merged with Frito-Lay of Dallas, and when I joined PepsiCo, PepsiCo's internal consulting unit in New York City, one of my very first clients was to work on a long-term basis with Frito-Lay. So I was a regular commuter between New York and Dallas as I spent a lot of time working with Frito-Lay. Pardon me, I've got a rough throat because I have been spending a lot of time with project teams recently, and especially today. I'm making this recording late at night after having spent virtually all day starting at noon working in video conferences with teams, because that's the time of year when we just simply do a lot of video recordings and have a lot of presentations. So if my voice is a little raspy, or if I have to stop to take a drink once in a while, I hope you'll forgive me. Okay, so during the years of 1977 and 78, PepsiCo acquired two fast food chains, Pizza Hut and Taco Bell. Later on, it also acquired Kentucky Fried Chicken in 1997, as you can see here. You can also see lots of other joint ventures, the partnership with Lipton Tea and the Starbucks joint venture to come up with a cold coffee drink. I overlooked in 1990 acquiring Mexico's largest cookie company. So by that time, PepsiCo was definitely in the food products business as well as the beverage business. And over the years, there have simply been lots and lots of mergers and acquisitions. In 1998, PepsiCo acquired Tropicana from Seagram in order to launch its effort into non-carbonated beverages, because by that time there had been health concerns about carbonated beverages. Among other things, carbonated beverages were associated with osteoporosis in women. It turned out that the more carbonated beverages young women consumed as teenagers and young women, the more likely they would be to get osteoporosis later in life. And that started what turned out to be the health craze in the beverage industry as well as the food products industry, and it's still going on today. You can see that in 2001, PepsiCo merged with Quaker, not to get into the cereal business, but to acquire the Gatorade, the sports drink, which was very popular and remains popular today. And then over time, it made investments in China. It made a big investment, I think more than $5 billion, in a company in Russia called Wimbledon, which is a producer of dairy products, as well as an operator of what would be similar to quick service restaurants here, more like maybe a convenience stores. The Wimbledon stores sell a variety of products, maybe a little bit like what drugstores sell if you leave out the drugs. So it's a convenience store that also sells its own dairy products. And after the acquisition in 2010, it also sells PepsiCo products. And then you see 2011, a Brazilian cookie company, another one of those. So this next slide simply points out some of the turning points in PepsiCo's relocations. It started out in New Bern, not too far from our location here outside of Raleigh, North Carolina. The pharmacist Caleb Bradham began to experiment with soft drink concoctions, as they're called here. Things didn't go too well at first. The company didn't make it and went out of business temporarily in 1923 and was bought out of bankruptcy for a total of $35,000, which was probably a pretty good investment even back then. There was a reorganization. The National Pepsi-Cola Company was formed in 1924. 1931, the president of a candy company, the Loft Candy Company, bought PepsiCo, or Pepsi-Cola. The company was moved to Long Island City, where a bottling company owned by PepsiCo still is located. I've actually been in that location because it's right across the East River from Manhattan, where our offices were located. You could see, and you can see when you're driving along the Hudson Parkway, you can see the big Pepsi-Cola sign over in Long Island, right as where Long Island gets started. Actually, it's more like Queens, the borough of Queens, but it's called Long Island City, and it's right next door to Manhattan. Anyway, the corporate headquarters were moved into Midtown Manhattan in '48, and they were moved around a bit. When I was at PepsiCo, the headquarters were at 300 Park Avenue and right across the street in 305 Park Avenue. So they occupied a lot of real estate in New York, which was kind of expensive, and the company needed more space. And so part of our work as consultants was to plan the relocation from New York City up to Westchester County in a town called Purchase, New York, which is where the company's magnificent campus headquarters with several buildings is located today. Another thing that's characterized the history of PepsiCo has been the variety of themes that it has used in advertising, because advertising and the use of media in consumer products is extremely as important, as you, I'm sure, already know. But Pepsi-Cola was one of the original users of media advertising, and it had various themes that you can see throughout the slide. And I don't think that I need to read them all to you. You ought to recognize a lot of them. The Pepsi generation is maybe one, gotta have it, and so forth. But one of the interesting things is about Pepsi's use of media is that it was the very first company to use media advertising on the radio. When it did that, we didn't have television. This was before television. You can see they started doing it in 1939. And for the very first time, across the radio waves came this jingle. I was born in 1942, and I can tell you that in around 1948, I was just young enough to know what I was doing when I was sitting in front of the radio in the living room after dinner, and before dinner for that matter, listening to the shows on radio like Sky King and the Lone Ranger and the Sergeant Preston of the Yukon. And they were all radio programs. And in these radio programs, for the very first time back in the early 1939 and 1940, people started to hear advertisements like this one. Here's the very first advertisement that was on the radio. Let's see if we can make it play. Okay, so I don't know whether you heard that very well because I forgot to put the speaker up next to the microphone. But it goes like this. Pepsi-Cola hits the spot, 12 full ounces, that's a lot. Twice as much for a nickel too. Pepsi-Cola is the one for you. nickel, 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 nickel. And the whole idea here was that its arch rival Coca-Cola was sold for a dime a bottle. And the Coca-Cola bottle had only 6 ounces in it. And it was very popular. But this guy who took over PepsiCo was a real marketer. And back in those days, you may not remember it, but you can ask your mom and she'll know. When my mom and my grandma took milk bottles back to when they bought milk or soda or whatever was in a bottle at the grocery store, they would virtually leave a nickel as a deposit on the bottles that this milk and these other drinks were in. And when they brought the bottles back to the grocery store, they'd get their nickel back. It was a deposit. So it was part of the price they paid, but there was a deposit there, and you could get that deposit back. And this guy who ran PepsiCo was a real resourceful fellow, very innovative. And he realized that those bottles really didn't go anywhere. And that beer bottles, about the shape that you see on the screen here where it says 5 cents, could be collected, washed out, and a label put on them, and PepsiCo-Cola put in those bottles. And the bottles happened to be 12 ounces, and he got the bottles for free, or essentially for free. So the liquid that went in the bottle was worth just as much as the bottle, and it wasn't 5 cents. So back then, you could get a 12-ounce bottle of Pepsi-Cola for a nickel. And so the jingle that touted the advantage, the appeal of getting a Pepsi instead of a Coke was twice as much for a nickel to PepsiCo is the one for you. And there you have it. That was the first advertising campaign, and it was a big success. And Pepsi-Cola and PepsiCo ever since has been pretty much an innovator in media advertising. If I do say so, even though I'm an alumnus of PepsiCo, I think they're much better at it than Coke. Okay, so innovations, indeed, all kinds of innovations, and you can see a whole bunch of them on this screen. Everything from the new formula in 1931 to the 12-ounce bottle that sold for 5 cents. Advertising history with Nickel Nickel, 1940. Pepsi, for those who think young, boy, I remember that one. I was there then, and that was a real hit because we had to figure out who we wanted to appeal to. And at that particular time, there was a group of people in the population that were growing faster than others. And they were teenagers and young adults. In short, they were the baby boom that was created right after the war. When the war ended, people who were old enough to have babies began to feel real amorous, and the result was lots of babies. And a few years later, teenagers and then young adults that was the Pepsi generation that we aimed our media advertising toward. And so you can see here lots of other innovations, the use of Michael Jackson, TV commercials, coming up with new kinds of drinks that were not colas, the multi-pack, the cube. There was another that I remember, the use of plastic injection blow molded bottles. All those were innovations, and again, were part of advertising strategy. Another characteristic of PepsiCo's history has been the way it changed its strategy step by step with each additional chief executive. So every time there was a change in a chief executive, such as when Charles Guth, who was that president of Loft Candy, took the helm, PepsiCo went into a fast growth mode. You can trace the history of PepsiCo through the changing of these CEOs. This handsome-looking, diplomatic-looking guy, Don Kendall, was CEO when I was at PepsiCo. And among other things, he's the one who took PepsiCo to Russia and did the first deal to sell an American product in Russia after Nixon broke ground in Russia. His deal was to help companies form to blend and bottle and sell PepsiCo to make the syrup that, or the concentrate that PepsiCo was made from. The problem was that then Russia had no hard currency that could be exchanged for other free market currencies. There were no reserve. Russia was not what's called a reserve currency. So Kendall, being the innovator that he was, did a deal to take his payment in vodka. And so PepsiCo got paid in Russian vodka, I believe the Smirnoff label, and PepsiCo got the exclusive rights to sell that vodka in the United States. So instead, and then they could sell the vodka for a handsome price in the US and do quite well. You may recognize the name underneath Don Kendall's, John Sculley. He eventually became CEO of Apple and did a terrible job. So Steve Jobs had to come back into Apple after Sculley to get it going again. There's a name left out between Sculley and Rico. I'm sorry, after Sculley became Roger Enrico, and we'll be hearing more about Enrico. He came up with a very important strategy or a marketing technique that was strategic in nature. It's called the power of one, which essentially was an alliance between PepsiCo, the corporation, the Pepsi-Cola bottlers who were franchised, the Frito-Lay bakers, and the retail grocery chains like Kroger and I don't know, who do we have around here? Food Lion. To work jointly to market soft drinks and snack foods together. So when you walk down the aisle in the grocery store, on one side you see PepsiCo's beverage products, and on the other side you see Frito-Lay products. And when somebody goes shopping for what they're going to have for a party or a picnic or just to stock the refreshment part of the cupboard at home, when they want to pick up snack foods, Frito-Lay, they also probably want to get soft drinks, and vice versa. And so this power of one, putting all the forces together, was extremely powerful and successful. Now, after Enrico came a guy named Reynemood. We'll see him near the end of this case presentation, but it was left out here. But between Enrico and the current CEO, Indra Nooyi, was, I believe, Stephen Reynemood. Basically, his claim to fame was he kept on with the power of one. Anyway, the current CEO is Indra Nooyi, and I don't think there's an I there. I think it's just Indra Nooyi. Mrs. Nooyi is a brilliant lady. She's maybe one of the best CEOs in the world, and certainly in the United States. She was born in India, got her first college degree in India, got an advanced degree there too, and then got an MBA from Yale. She went to work for a large consulting firm, specialized in strategy. Yeah, that's my field. And eventually, after working at another company, became vice president for strategic management at PepsiCo. then became vice president and chief financial officer at PepsiCo, worked with Roger Enrico to make some major acquisitions, including that one in Russia that I told you about. And eventually, when it came time to appoint the next CEO, she had made such a record for herself that even though there were more senior vice presidents waiting to be named CEO, the board of directors saw the talent in this lady and appointed her. And since she has been the CEO of PepsiCo, she has just done a phenomenal job by introducing all sorts of more innovations in the areas of health foods and healthy drinks, healthy snack foods, and so forth, and really changing the very nature of PepsiCo, all for the better. So that's the history of PepsiCo in various versions. Now we'll talk about Pepsi's mission. And you may recall Ansoff's matrix, which asks 3 questions. What market will we serve? What segment of the population? Second, what are the unmet needs in that population segment? And third, what kind of distinctive competences are required to meet those needs? So this team broke up the markets into the buyer groups, the segments of the actual buyers, the customers of PepsiCo. Of course, those are the grocery store chains, the quick service restaurant chains. By that I mean Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, McDonald's, and so forth. And then the convenience stores, which were a more recent addition. So that's one group. The other group, of course, is the folks who actually consume the product. And I've already mentioned that teens and young adults initially were very important to PepsiCo. Today, those teens and young adults are my age. You know, they're no longer teens and young adults. They're senior citizens. So as time passes, the way we market to target market groups has to change, along with the characteristics of the people who've come to accept our products. Now, the good news is that there's a real interest in being healthy in the United States today. And so you can see that the 4th bullet is people who want to be healthy. Another theme was of PepsiCo in its advertising was, and there was a little jingle that went with that, for those who think young, if you remember that in the advertising. So people want to be healthy, people want to be young, and of course now a whole new group of consumers, or several new groups, and those are people in different regions of the world and different countries. And so when PepsiCo is in India, and PepsiCo went to India because Mrs. Nooyi is Indian by birth, and she was able to take PepsiCo to India, first by doing a joint venture, and then later, when the law of India permitted, buying the majority interest out and owning its own company 100%. So India, very important. As you might imagine, China is very important because China is the growth market of today. India is probably the growth market of the future. So where do we find unmet needs, the needs that everybody has in this market, but where a company's management feels that those needs aren't being met adequately so that it can find ways to meet them better. So this team talked about stimulation. For instance, Mountain Dew. Boy, I remember when Mountain Dew was brought out. It had enough caffeine and sugar to let you walk on the ceiling. People came back from the Vietnam War and went to school on the GI Bill and pulled all-nighters drinking Mountain Dew. And frankly, some of you still do, I'll bet you. It's number 6 in the ranked beverage carbonated beverage still after all that time. So it's still a popular drink. But more important, perhaps, is the other items that are listed here under healthy choices, whether it's sugar-free, caffeine-free, doesn't have aspartame. That's what's in the sugar-free product, cholesterol-free if it's baked products like snacks, and actually good for you, nutritious. So those are some of the unmet needs. So then the, whoops, let me see, unmet needs. So then to be more specific about these health issues, you can see that on the left side of this slide, we've got a number of health issues in the United States. And they include diabetes, obesity, osteoporosis, cholesterol, blood pressure, and so forth. So recognizing that these health issues are growing in importance because of the aging of the population, new competences are required in this industry to meet these needs that aren't adequately met. And so the ABLES model asks us to look into the competences that are required to meet those needs. And you can see what this team came up with. Market research, just what is it that in the tastes and the preferences that the culture, not just of the United States, but in various other countries, might lead to in the way of product preferences, whether it's beverages or snack foods. And then you need laboratories, research and development, biologists, nutritionists, and so forth, biochemists to come up with the kind of flavors that appeal to people. The ability to use media advertising, some of that same stuff that flowed out of the coming up with jingles and so forth. All kinds of media advertising are really needed today. And just to be sure that we don't forget that PepsiCo is in the snack food business, there are new kinds of baking that are required to make healthier products. All of those are included in the required competences. And so this is a little item that the team picked out from PepsiCo's literature. I'm not going to read it to you. You can just read it for yourself. But this is a statement that the team found from PepsiCo's literature that sort of embodies all those things that we were just talking about. So with that, I'll move on to the lines of business. What exactly does PepsiCo make, and where do they make it? And here you see a summary of the business units, the major business units at PepsiCo. And you can see that they include FLNA, Frito-Lay, North America, QFNA, Quaker Foods, North America, NAB, North American Beverages, that would be PepsiCo and other beverages. But then you can see that also there are three divisions that are focused on geography: Latin America, see if I can remember, Europe, and Sub-Saharan Africa, meaning the southern part of Africa, and then AMENA, Asia, Middle East, and Northern Africa. So Africa is divided essentially between the portion that is really undeveloped. Northern Africa, of course, is where Iran, Iraq, Syria, Libya are located. And if you see much news, you know that that's where there's a lot of war and hostility going on. Southern Africa is a little less turbulent. The Republic of South Africa is essentially stable. Kenya, probably stable. So PepsiCo saw fit to divide Africa in those two categories. And as you can see, PepsiCo's sales last year were almost $63 billion. So it's a great big corporation that made almost $11 billion in operating profit. You don't have to be much of a mathematician to know that that's a nice, rich operating profit margin. 11 divided by 63. I don't know what you'd get, but I imagine it's probably in the neighborhood of about what 18%. We'll see later. Okay, and then you can see something else on the pie charts down below, and that is that North American beverages, the ones that people think about when they think about PepsiCo, account for a third of total revenues. Now, revenues in those three geographic regions would add even more to the beverage, to the importance of beverages to PepsiCo's sales. And then you can see Frito-Lay, North America, Quaker Foods, North America. Those are food products, which also are sold in Latin America, Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, Middle East, and Northern Africa. So food and beverage products both are sold in those geographic regions as well. So, and we will see later on what the mix of food to beverages is, but beverages a little more in the way, food product a little more in the way of sales. But when you look at the operating profit, you can see that North American beverages it contributes 27% of operating profit, whereas over on the left it contributes 34% of sales. So its profit margins aren't as great as food products are. You can see that whereas Frito-Lay contributed 25% of sales or revenues, it contributes 43% of profit. So the real profit generator at PepsiCo no longer is the beverages, it's the snack foods. Okay, and here we see another important characteristic of PepsiCo, and that is that although it's in lots of countries and is trying to do more business internationally, a large portion of its business is still in the United States. 58% of sales, and then we add Canada with 4%. That takes it up in North America to 62%. And it's invested, it's long-lived assets, it's capital, structural capital, machinery, property, plant, and equipment. 61% in the U.S. and another 5%, so a total of 2/3, 66% in North America. So PepsiCo is an international company, but its largest operations, its largest sources of revenues and profits are still here in North America. If we add Mexico, then those amounts get even, those proportions get even larger. So one of PepsiCo's challenges going into the future is to extend its market participation in outside of the domestic market, outside of North America. One reason for that is that Coca-Cola really has the jump on PepsiCo and has much larger shares of foreign markets than PepsiCo does. And that again goes back to history. Back in the Second World War, the CEO of Coke, who was also a very innovative guy, got together with the commander of the Allied forces, a guy named Eisenhower, and offered to provide Coke for, I think, a dime, still a dime, and to provide it everywhere that the Allies had occupied territory. And Eisenhower was so favorably impressed with the proposal that he went to President Truman and asked for a waiver on sugar rationing so that Coke could make its concentrate. And with that, Coca-Cola was able to put bottling plants wherever the Allied armies went, just so our folks in uniform could have a Coke. But when the war ended, Coke was essentially established all over the world, and it has continued to exploit that position of leadership. With that, let's see if we can find our way to move on. Here we have just some pictures of PepsiCo products, and you can see some of the better-known brands: Tropicana, Gatorade, Pepsi-Cola, and then the Lay's products, including Cheetos and Doritos, Quaker Oats, and so forth. And outside the United States, 7-Up. 7-Up outside the U.S. is a brand owned by PepsiCo. Very few people know that. So here's the sources of revenue that I was talking about before. You can see that domestic sales account for 58% of the total, foreign 42%. You can see that food products account for slightly more than half of the sales, beverages slightly less than half. And this is just a graph that shows the same things that I've already showed you before, but you can see that Frito-Lay North America is the big producer of profit, even though North American Beverages is the largest producer of sales. Here are some of the big brands owned by PepsiCo. We've already looked at them, so I'll just flip the slide. Here we have things broken down on the top, the snack foods. And again, what you see over on the right is a brand on the top, Walker's, that is a very popular brand of snacks in Europe, particularly in England. And then again, you see all kinds of brands, logos down in the bottom of this slide. So PepsiCo has a lot of major brands. And in fact, here are their top earning brands. This team really liked PepsiCo Brands because, frankly, they had just a few too many slides with all these brands in them. But there are a lot of them. Notice the alliance with Lipton. PepsiCo makes bottled Lipton tea, cold tea, under a license from Lipton. I'm looking for, oh yeah, and here's the Starbucks label for cold coffee. And here are some of PepsiCo's international brands, not all of which are offered in the United States. So in some countries, PepsiCo has launched brands with flavors that are uniquely tuned to the tastes of people in those countries. A rather interesting point is that the consumption and the desire to consume carbonated beverages really does differ between countries. So you can see Argentina is the #1 consumer, slightly larger than the US, and then Chile and Mexico and Uruguay. You can see something else too, and that is that Latin American countries like carbonated beverages. And PepsiCo has become keenly aware of that. So we will see later on that the United States is by far the largest consumer, but that Mexico is right behind it when we get into actual volumes of consumption. Here is a breakdown in a rather early one when the deal was done. But you can see this is the company in Russia, Wimbledon, the company that makes dairy products and has quick service, convenience stores. But you can see that more than two-thirds of its products at the time of the acquisition were dairy products. You can bet that the mix has changed by now, because those stores are now selling PepsiCo products, beverages, and snack foods. Rather interestingly, 12% were baby foods, because they are also dairy products. And then less than 20% at the time were beverages. And again, you can just rest assured that that proportion has changed. This is the Russian business. Now, this was a major acquisition for PepsiCo, and something that we need to bear in mind is that since then, what has happened in the relationships between Russia and the United States and Europe? The answer is nothing good. Russia took over the Crimea and annexed it, and it has sponsored hostilities in the Ukraine, in response to which sanctions have been placed on Russia, both by the US and its NATO partners in Europe and the EU. So as a result of those sanctions and the decline in oil prices, oil being the primary source of revenues in Russia, the Russian economy has really turned down. And as the economy has turned down, so has PepsiCo's return on its investment in Wimbledon. Now, presumably, Russia's fortunes will recover sometime, and when it does, PepsiCo will be right there to exploit its position. In the meantime, the return on this investment hasn't been as nice as it could have been. Now, here's an important slide, and it summarizes the mix of PepsiCo's business since 2009 at the depths of the recession, and then moves forward. And you can see that the widest part of these bars grows wider over time, and that's the business of Frito-Lay and Quaker, the food business. Quaker makes, as I'm sure you know, snack bars, granola bars, and so forth. And so between Quaker and Frito-Lay, you can see that the contribution of those businesses to the sales of PepsiCo have increased over the years. You can also see that Tropicana and juices has sort of remained flat, actually come down a little bit, and soft drinks have also remained pretty flat. And we will see later on in this analysis that soft drinks, because of their health food or health concerns, have not been a growing category for either Pepsi-Cola or Coca-Cola, but this category has declined for Pepsi-Cola and more than for Coke. And then finally, we see the sports and other beverages in the top orange bar, and they've been growing and make up a little larger proportion of the total than they did back in 2009. So essentially, that's a rundown of PepsiCo's history and its product lines and how they got to be that way. And so with that, I think I'm going to stop this recording. This will be the first of a series of recordings, just on the overlay of PepsiCo and its businesses. In the next file, the next video, we'll talk about PepsiCo's, the environment that PepsiCo does business in, the external forces in the economy, market, and industry. And if there's enough time, we'll also talk about PepsiCo's internal capabilities. So we'll talk about the evidence that has to be gathered to make strategic decisions. But for right now, if I'm able to, I am going to stop this recording